Hello, everyone. This is Professor Selassie, and we're going to talk about the justice system, specifically the school to prison pipeline. So let's key up our lecture here and jump right on in. This discussion is about how the American education system fails its students, particularly minority students, and has contributed to the largest prison population in the world. And how this happens is that there is a direct pipeline of young black men and women, brown men and women, and even white men and women directly into the prison system. Now, when I say black men and women and whites and Latinos, I'm not excluding other groups from this either. Asians and also Native Americans are susceptible as well, although their populations are much smaller due to some historic reasons. But the juvenile or the criminal justice system, and even including the juvenile justice system, works pretty effectively on Native American reservations. I can attest to that myself. But there is a strong sense among some Asian groups, like the Hmong, the Cambodians, Laotians, that they suffer disproportionately as well. So we might as well just lump all minority groups and disaffected white populations into this mix as well. And as we go through, I'll be explaining this to you. So what is the definition here? The definition is one where minors in minoritically and economically disadvantaged backgrounds are disproportionately incarcerated because of harsh school and municipal policies. We'll revisit this definition a little bit later on, but nevertheless, what we're talking about here is poor schools, lack of health care and employment for families, and harsh school penalties all contribute and work towards funneling minority students into the prison system. And then you probably might be asking yourself, well, why is that the case? Why would they do that? Some of it is just obviously punitive. We know for a fact that after the U.S. Civil War from 1861 to 1865, the prison population swelled, particularly in the southern United States, because the southern white population was arresting black people and sentencing them to work back on those former plantations. So if you were a black person and you didn't have a job, you could have been arrested by the police, taken to a judge, and they may have sentenced you to work 2 or 3 years on the former plantation that you had subsequently received your freedom from. This was a means to try to have, again, a dependent, subservient, second-class population. So today the game has shifted radically because slavery is no more. So then why would this school-to-prison pipeline be in effect? Well, we just know for a fact that society is inherently racist and skewed against minorities. If you haven't figured out now that we live in a racist, sexist, homophobic society, I really don't know what to tell you. It's geared towards depressing minorities. Now, this isn't to say that every single person that is a minority is depressed. That's certainly not to say that. What I am saying here is that there are certain advantages that come to you for having lighter skin color. That is a fact beyond change. So let's take a look at some of the statistics here. If we take a look at the Pew Research Center, who does some fabulous research on demographics and et cetera, and you can just Google in Pew Research Center, you can find a tremendous amount of information. The racial and ethnic gap has been shrinking from 2007 to 2017 between black prisoners and white prisoners. 2007, there were 592,000, almost 593,000 black prisoners, almost 500,000 white prisoners, and about 330,000 Hispanic prisoners, Latino-X prisoners. Today, the black prison population is decreasing, and so is the white, but the black prison population is decreasing at a far greater rate, where almost today, in 2000, this is 2017, so it's probably shrunk even greater 2021, but the black and white population is almost the same. So you probably heard when you were a lot younger that black people were incarcerated at higher rates because they were committing more crimes, that sort of thing. A lot of hokey nonsense. It's not that black people commit more crimes than white people do, it's that black people get arrested at greater rates than white people do. There is crime in every single community. There are people who don't want to play the game in every race in America. The question is, who gets arrested, who gets let go? So what this chart is to suggest is a couple of things. One, the size of just the overall prison population is enormous. Today, there are probably about 2.3 million prisoners when we count up Asians and Native Americans, etc. The prison population is the largest. I think China has the second largest prison population in the world, and that is a repressive society. Now let's take a look at the next chart. Black Hispanics make up larger shares of prisoners than the U.S. population. So what this is suggesting here is that when we take a look at the prison populations and we just factor in sort of where black people represent about 14% of the population, but their numbers, right, are skewed, right? So whites make up, say, 64% of the population, but they only make up 30% of the prisoners. So how is it that 33% of the black population can be in jail when they only make up 12% of the population? Now, if you're just one who just says, well, they commit all the crimes, so therefore that is a lot of hokey nonsense. Now, certainly poverty, there is an issue, but what crimes are we actually talking about? That is the overall question, and that is one that you can do some research on your own. But here is what we know about prison populations and why public policy is so important. 18% of Americans, just the overall general percent of the American population, don't have high school diplomas. That's a relatively small number. And what that suggests is that Americans get high school diplomas. So we're doing a pretty good job of just giving people just a very fundamental basic education. It's not Exeter, but it will get the job done. However, when you look at the prison population, 40% of the prisoners do not have high school diplomas. 40%, that's just under 10% under half. And almost all prisoners who do have high school diplomas, they all have GEDs. So what happens? They went to school, they dropped out and got a GED. Of all the groups, Latinos have the lowest educational attainment. Latinos in the United States don't graduate from high school. They just don't. And questions are why? Black women have the highest educational attainment of all groups in America. Black women are getting the job done. Then below Latinos are blacks and then whites. So what's keeping blacks from reducing, or I should say increasing their high school graduation rate, although it's fairly high, is black males. Black males are not getting the job done. So if you're white in America, you have a high school diploma. If you are black in America, you probably have a high school diploma. If you are Latinx in America, it's probably likely you don't have a high school diploma. So then what does this mean? There are no Latino lawyers. There are no Latino doctors, no Latino engineers, computer scientists. You name it. You can go down the line through the professions and say that it's woefully lacking. It's also woefully lacking for black people as well. There were probably more doctors, lawyers in America, in black America, in the 1930s than there probably are today. Now, the reason for that is, and this is for black America specifically, is that law schools, graduate schools, medical schools, and even colleges conspired to keep black people out. At Harvard, they actually had a quota on the number of blacks they would let in and the number of Jews. So if you are a highly gifted and qualified black student or Jewish student, and your application was at the bottom of the pile, and they had already let in their 10 black people, you were not getting into Harvard. So over time, black people just simply stopped applying to places like Harvard because they just knew that they weren't going to get in. And if you did get in to Harvard back in those days, you couldn't stay in the dormitories. So you had to find lodging elsewhere. Same thing with Jewish students. Oftentimes, you had to sit in a desk that was off to the side from the rest of the students because the white students didn't want to sit next to you, you and the Jewish students. Or the professor would never call on you when you raised your hand if you had a question. Or they would make jokes about you in class, about black people or Jews in class. So this is a problem because what blacks and Latinos have done is that they've decided, and this is men, have decided that what's the point of getting an education if you can't do anything with it? Now, things have reversed quite a bit from when I was a young person. When I was a young person, there had already been one wave of black people being able to get into places like Harvard. There was a wave before me. I was in the second wave of students that was looking towards. Now, for me, Harvard wasn't an option because my grades were not at all there. I decided to go to a historically black college for a whole host of reasons. One is that I just fundamentally knew that I was going to need extra help because I was going to get a STEM degree. And if I went to a place like UCLA and I wanted to raise my hand and ask questions, I wasn't at all confident after just one generation of students had gone through that I would get the help that I would needed. But at a black college where there were black professors, I knew that if I raised my hand, the professor would call on me and I would get help. So this has a big problem. We can look at the prison population and almost assuredly say the reason why students move from school to delinquency to prison is because they simply can't read. Go up to a prison. Nobody can read in prison. Whose fault is that? Is this a symptom of the teachers, the schools, the administrations, the school districts, the parents, society, or the individual themselves? Maybe it's a complete combination of all of them. I got a high school diploma. It wasn't all that difficult to get one. I got one. So I pretty much think that just fundamentally, basically, it's probably an easy thing to do is to get a high school diploma. So it's not that anybody can't get one because I have one. And I know if I have one, anybody can get one. So what is it? Seems to me that black and brown people are looking at education and saying, just don't want to put up with that. So what is the cost of having this prison industrial complex? And we'll take a look at this in just a moment. $80 billion the United States spends each year on corrections. $80 billion. $80 billion. Let's take a look at one state to see how this $80 billion kind of really plays out in real time. The state of Maryland spends about $37,000 per person per year to house them. And this is just basic 3 meals a day, kind of like you get your sloppy Joe and you get your laundry, and I guess you turn on the lights. $37,000 per person. Yet they only spend $12,000 for students to get through preschool to 12th grade per person per year. So what happens if you flip this around, that you spent $37,000 per year per pupil, and you only spent $12,000 per year for corrections? You probably would have less prisoners because you probably wouldn't allow you to run a very large prison. So this is all about public policy. Public policy decisions are made as such where we spend more money to incarcerate people than we do to educate people. And what is happening to these prisoners once they get into prison? Are they being educated? A lot of prisons don't have education systems. They say they're not about rehabilitation. Rehabilitation, they say, it's too costly. It's about punishing the individual, and prisons ought to be hard. Okay. So what happened? Where did all of this stuff come from? This was an actual public policy decision to wage war on minority communities. As a result of the civil rights movement, Black people were trying to become politically active in the South. The only viable political party in the South was the Democratic Party, and we've had a discussion on this. The only viable party was the Democratic Party, so Black people attempted to join the Democratic Party. Those racist Southerners called themselves Dixiecrats, and they advocated for things like states' rights. And why states' rights? Because they didn't want the federal government telling them that they had to give equal rights to Black people. So the white Southern Dixiecrats or Democrats rejected the Black Democrats. Well, this was pretty known to everybody what was going on, and what happened was Richard Nixon, who was president of the United States in the 1960s, decided to lure those disaffected Dixiecrats into the Republican Party. Nixon was a Republican. Black people all over America had been Republicans. In the South, they could not be Republicans simply because there was no viable Republican Party in the South. So those Dixiecrats decided to move into the Republican Party, and they were welcomed. Nixon was in the deep throes with the Vietnam War protests against him because young people didn't want to go to war and they thought the war was immoral. Black Americans were still struggling to gain civil rights. So Nixon decided to wage war, a law and order campaign, as he called it. His enemies were young white liberals and Black Americans. So he put police out on the street to beat up Vietnam War protesters, both black and white. He also began a policy of making certain drugs or certain things, because I was going to say marijuana is not really a drug, to be illegal in the United States. And why marijuana? Simply because marijuana was the number one preference of black people. Black people didn't do hard drugs, but they did marijuana. It was a drug of black musicians. There was also a full-scale campaign, which we know now. We didn't know then, but a full-on scale campaign to link black people to heroin. So young white demonstrators were being beaten up and shot, like at Kent State in May of 1970, by National Guardsmen for protesting against the Vietnam War. And black Americans, like the Black Panthers and other groups, were being shot in their beds, arrested for possession of marijuana, and a full-scale blown war on drugs was initiated by the Nixon administration. This war on drugs wreaked havoc in the black community. Here is the one thing that black people have always talked about since the war on drugs started. Most of the hardcore drugs like cocaine, etc., is not manufactured in the United States, although methamphetamines now are. But just generally speaking, cocaine, which is one of the choices of the communities for drugs, crack cocaine, powdered cocaine, that comes from outside of the United States. And black people would always say this hypothetically: black people don't fly no airplanes, so how did all these drugs get into America? That was always an interesting question. So black men, black communities were preyed upon by the police and ravaged. Incarceration rates skyrocketed. In 1986, Just Say No campaign. This was Ronald Reagan's second term as president of the United States. And his wife here, Nancy Reagan, came out and said, "We're trying to keep people from doing drugs. Just say no." It was ridiculous. People who are addicted to drugs, have you seen now with the opioid epidemic? People just can't say no. It's addictive. That's the whole point. So there were out and out war on drugs spanning from the 1970s into the 1980s. The news media had a decisive role to play in all of this as well, because they sensationalized every single drug bust, drug arrest, drug story they could, and made it seem like the black community was completely taken over and ravaged by drugs. And here is the shocker. If you look at statistics, black people do drugs disproportionately less than all other groups. Disproportionately less than all other groups. So why is it that more black people were being arrested and sent to prison for drug selling and possession than all other groups? Black Americans are the most conservative people in the United States. So not only was public policy at the government level fostering this kind of idea of stamping out crime and getting at the drug problem in America, but the news media was in the habit of piping this out and completely to the communities, particularly the white communities. So every time you open the paper, people would sit there at their coffee tables and say, something must be done about this. So the inner cities in the 1980s were a battle zone. So I left Los Angeles in 1980 and was back in LA off and on from 80 to 88. But I came back to Los Angeles full time just to resettle because I was just all over the place from 80 to 88. I came back to LA to settle full time in 88. And Los Angeles was a completely different place than what I left it in 1980. There were and was a war on the street between rival gangs for territory over the drug trade. And there were wars between police departments, specifically the LAPD, and groups like the Bloods and the Crips, and many other groups as well, not just them. The principal protagonist in all of this, or antagonist, I should say, was Daryl Gates, who created the DARE program. And he basically stated one day that casual drug users should be taken out and shot because they were, as he would say, were fueling the drug trade. And this is the head of the LAPD who said this. What happened to the war on drugs? We spent $1 trillion, 1.6 million drug arrests in 2010 alone. 8 million arrested for pot since 2000. 8 million people arrested for smoking a plant that grows naturally in the environment. People have been smoking, using ganja and hemp for a millennia, thousands of years. And you're going to put some person in jail for smoking it. What kind of sadistic society do you have that would do something like that? And here is the overall kicker for me. Remember when I stated just a few seconds ago about all those drugs getting into the black community? Gary Webb here, who was a reporter for the San Jose Mercury News, began writing a series of articles called the Dark Alliance series. What he began to investigate is how, in fact, did all of that crack and that cocaine get into America in the first place? And this is what he found. That the CIA had been allowing groups that were fighting against communists in Nicaragua to bring drugs into the United States to sell, and the proceeds, the profits, would be used to buy weapons to fight against a government the United States did not like. The series that Gary Webb wrote was extremely controversial, and he was literally hounded and literally dismissed from his job. His life was ruined. The newspaper distanced themselves. He was attacked by all kinds of people in the U.S. government. His life was threatened by unknown persons that we just know were from the CIA and FBI and other groups. 2004, Gary Webb committed suicide. People went back and re-looked at his evidence and suggested that he was in fact correct. Because the question that you have to ask yourself is, how did all of those drugs get into the United States? We have satellites that can tell you what the date is on a dime on the ground, but we can't figure out how to stop drugs coming into the United States. I don't believe that. I don't buy that. From 80 to 97, look at the jump in the incarceration rates for nonviolent drug offenses. This is just for you buying, maybe some crack and smoking it. We went from 1980 to 50,000 to 400,000. From in 1980 we incarcerated 50,000 people. 1997 we incarcerated 400,000. Just arrested them for nonviolent drug offenses. So if you have a couple ounces of ganja, you would have been arrested, sent to jail. Helping to spur this school to prison pipeline was the infamous crime bill. Now, the crime bill, there's a little bit of background to this, and I'm just going to talk about it really quickly. It wasn't just that drugs were pushing the crime bill. In 1993, there was a cult group called the Branch Davidians who the ATF, wanted to get into their house because they had illegal arms, or allegedly had illegal arms and guns and all that kind of stuff. And what ended up happening is a shootout. I think like 6 or 7 ATF agents were killed. Many more were wounded. Several of the Branch Davidians burned up alive or were shot in a compound. And people said that we needed to get a hold of what's going on. In 1993, Gianluigi Ferri, for some reason in San Francisco, was angry. We're not quite sure why he was angry, but he had a slew of guns. It had been allegedly stated that somewhere along the line he was angry at attorneys. So in San Francisco, he went up into an attorney's office and basically killed 6 people using automatic weapons. Now, coupled with these, there were demands for gun control, demands for stiffer penalties for crimes. So along with the drug war, Joe Biden and Jay Brooks of Texas authorized the crime bill. 356 pages, $9.7 billion in funding, 100,000 new police officers, new prisons, prevention programs. And I'll have to say this about Joe Biden. Joe Biden was doing what people wanted. The American public wanted it. Black people wanted it. Brown people wanted it. Asian people wanted it. And white people wanted it. People wanted something done about crime. Most black politicians, not all, most black politicians voted for it because things were getting out of hand, at least so they said. People were looking at the small picture and not being able to look at the larger picture. Where were the drugs coming from? If your problem is drugs getting in, shouldn't that be your focal point? Gary Webb is telling you what's going on, but no, you can't go to the CIA and spray up the building. So you have to go to the local communities and bust the petty drug dealers. If you ever want to see how all of this played out, why the drug war was such a farce, watch the television series The Wire. The Wire was the greatest television series ever made. And they go step by step by step on why the war on drugs was a complete farce. And this isn't a documentary. This is just a regular series. It came on HBO, I believe. But it just, with the characters and the script and the writing, the guy who actually wrote this was a former police officer in Baltimore, in Bmore. And he realized at some point that the war on drugs was a complete farce, wasn't getting anywhere. And so he wrote this script for this television series, exactly the things that he saw. And you'll watch this show and you'll go, wow, incredible. So we've moved with all of this stuff that's happening within the communities to building the greatest prison industrial complex the world has ever known. 109 federal prisons. So if you do drugs, if you try to move drugs into the United States, you'll probably end up at a federal prison. If you're just selling on the street, you'll probably end up in a state prison. (1,719) state prisons. 3,163 local jails. 80 Indian jails. 1,772 juvenile correction facilities with 105,000 juveniles incarcerated. Again, minors and minority and economically disadvantaged backgrounds and communities are disproportionately incarcerated because of harsh school and municipal policies. Again, public policies. Young people in school are targeted early. School disturbance policies. So if you're a young person in school and you're not behaving, chances are, because there are police in schools, you probably will be arrested. They have zero tolerance policies. And the thing about it is that young people are young people. Young people sometimes just don't know any better. Minds are not developed, having problems at home. You've seen that in school, people acting out, and you know it's just not because they're just doing that for whatever. There's probably their home lives are not straight. All of these have led to the school to prison pipeline. And who benefits from all of this? That's the greater question. Who benefits? Prison industrial complex benefits. The people that run prisons are oftentimes contractors, private businesses. And here is the real kicker. In 2021, in 2020 today, we are moving away from having prisons. We realize that all of this stuff is right. Yep, the school to prison pipeline is there, exists, it's wrong, all that stuff. So let's do away with prisons, especially for low offenders. So what they do to you now is they just put an ankle bracelet on you. And that ankle bracelet's a monitor. So you can't go more than, let's say, 10, 15 feet outside of your house. Or the thing goes off and you're in violation of your parole or your prison sentence. So what happens? This is much more devious and much better thing, because now we don't have to actually have jail to house all these low petty criminals. The real serious ones we have to lock up and throw away the key. But just because you're selling crack on the corner, trying to make some money to buy some food for your daughter. No, what we do is we turn your house into a prison. That's what we're going to do here. Turn your house into a prison. Man, that's ingenious. So who still makes money? The company that builds the ankle monitors, the company that sells the ankle monitors, and the company that does the ankle monitoring all make money. And they don't even have to build one single wall, because your house is the prison. In schools, blacks are suspended in greater numbers in every state in the U.S. than white students. 5% of white students in school are suspended, but 16% of blacks. That's because black people are causing all the trouble. No. We know from the research that white teachers will suspend black students at a higher rate than whites, even for the same infractions. So white teachers are specifically picking on black students. We know this factually. 27% of those students in school, black students, are referred to the police. When the police do arrest, black students make up 31%. So when blacks are being suspended at a higher rate, being referred to the police at a higher rate, and actually being arrested at a higher rate. So one of the things that I've been asked is that give me an example of where this happens and how it happens. Okay, and I'll give you an example. When I am around other black people, we just have a certain way of talking to each other. When we're talking about sports, arguing, sometimes my white friends who are around me and my black friends will say, wow, you guys are dogging each other out pretty good when we're talking about sports teams and whatever. And I always refer to them and I always say things like, no, we're just playing the dozens. That's just what we do. So young black students have a way of expressing themselves in a different way than, say, white students. And sometimes white teachers don't understand that. They don't understand black culture. So when they think that a student is talking back or being uncooperative, it's just the way the society and the culture is structured. All right. And we talked a little bit about the statistics about high school diplomas. So in closing here, what do we do about all of this? What do we do about the school to prison pipeline? Well, for one, restorative justice. Any person that has ever been convicted of any nonviolent drug crime should have their record expunged, period. Editorial decisions at newspapers need to be changed. Decriminalization of drugs. Nobody should be arrested for smoking ganja anywhere, possessing ganja anywhere, and improving just overall education, particularly the amount of money that we spend on education. More books, fewer bombs. So I think what the charge is for young students who are trying to figure out what they want to do in the world is to get a public policy degree and get in there and start working on some restorative justice, decriminalization of drugs, improving education, and working in newspapers and not writing dumb stories about how somebody got busted for a bag of marijuana. It's ridiculous. Okay, so that ends our discussion on the school to prison pipeline. If you have any questions, please let me know.